In a forum where people shared their closest encounters with the paranormal, I once posted this story. It was the first time I had ever told anyone. I didn't always live in this house. I used to live far away, near the mountains of the region. It was a small country town, with a school, a bank, a town hall, and all the characteristics of a typical American town. It was the kind of place where you spend your childhood and then leave in search of work. However, we left much sooner. I was 8 years old when it happened, during the month of rains. The city had no warning of these rains for miles around. The weather forecast predicted clear skies, but the rains began unannounced. The clear sky gradually turned gray. Clouds gathered and darkened, and then the fog arrived. At first, school was canceled, and we were all happy. But since the rain never stopped and you couldn't keep everything closed for a whole month, it reopened with everyone wearing raincoats. The townspeople resumed their activities. Where possible, the rain became increasingly intense. Transportation was halted. Power lines were struck by lightning, and for a time, the city was cut off from the rest of the world. No one could enter, no one could leave. Communication was impossible, and the roads were blocked. It was during this period that we children began to hear them. I don't remember who was the first, perhaps the boy from 5th grade or my desk mate, but one by one, we all began to hear them and speak about them in fear. We heard the whispers in the rain, especially at night, coming from outside the window. We heard them on the way home from school, or in the garden during recess. We heard them when we went to the supermarket. We could hear them when we got out of the car. They became more numerous and clearer over time. At first, we couldn't understand what they were saying. The words were garbled, murmured, drowned out by the sound of rain. The ones I heard most often were "Come with us," and "At night, open the window," in perfect English. After a week, the voices became clearer, louder, more numerous, and even more menacing. Now, they were urging us to go into the woods, where the voices seemed to come from. Some stopped harming us at night, and we began to hear 2 words all over town every 5 meters. These 2 terrible words became increasingly frequent. The crowd of voices would say them at the end, then stop speaking until the next time we heard them. It was their way of saying goodbye, and all the children agreed that before falling asleep, they would hear these 2 words whispered near their ears. We talked to the adults about it, but they didn't believe us. They dismissed it as a mass illusion and self-conviction of a group of children's fantasies. And today, as an adult, I'm also skeptical about this experience. Yet I remember distinctly hearing that phrase, and no child seemed to be playing with it, especially after the 27th, when the children began to disappear. Some disappeared on their way home, others during recess, and others at night. The police found no evidence or leads. They vanished without a trace. There were no signs of forced entry or tampering with locks. Windows were open from the inside. It was as if the children had seen something and had spontaneously gone to the woods on the city's outskirts, disappearing. Only the footprints were impossible to detect, obscured by the incessant rain and mud. Investigations among the children were fraught with fear. Even those who disappeared were in their 20s. Isaacs, a boy from our class, claimed to see the one who spoke to me in the woods. He called it an angel, very tall and pale, inviting us to go with him. The son of the local priest, on the other hand, said it was a devil for children and suggested an experiment. When you see it, ask it to pray, and if it's a devil, it won't be able to do it. But I've never seen this creature myself. But every night, I remembered the words to say if I encountered it and was scared. We all were as our best friends disappeared before our eyes. Animals were restless, dogs barked at nothing, and most importantly, there were no more birds except for crows. Moreover, since the 26th, we began to see some vultures. On March 31st, on the last day, I was awakened by my mother. In the city, a siren was sounding, and everyone was running through the streets. The police were armed, and traffic officers were whistling everywhere. An immediate evacuation had been ordered. My mother and I ran with the others. My father was a policeman, and he went in the opposite direction, towards the woods. I heard the officers mumbling. They saw men, They heard their voices. Now, as we ran, I turned around, searching for my father in the distance, right where the officers were going, but it seemed like they almost passed by him, through him, without touching him. A man in the back, blending into the indistinguishable fog. Nevertheless, he was perfectly perceptible. He urged us to follow him, to come with him, and his requests grew increasingly urgent. My mother couldn't see him or hear him, and I, worried, kept running. So he was practically behind me. I heard him, felt his touch, felt his icy breath on my temples, and he whispered those two dreadful words, "You die." I turned around terrified and shouted, "Pray," but in front of me, there wasn't a tall, gray man. It was something even more unsettling, stranger, and yet simpler than I could imagine, my reflection. It moved as I did, just inches from me, a distorted, hazy reflection, almost like a ghost. It was gray, and there was something off about it because it was as if the mirror in front of me were made of air or water. I reached out my hand. He did too. The touch was cold, but my hand touched nothing but cold air, and his hand dissolved like smoke. Now my mother could see it too, and as I moved my hand, its image dissipated into the wind. It was perhaps one of those doppelgangers, and when you see them, it's an omen of death. A few days later, the situation returned to normal. The children were found scared and hungry in the woods. Scientists offered a strange explanation. It seemed that the winds had formed a kind of circle around the city, like a massive, very slow-moving cyclone, whose central eye surrounded the entire city. The city was immersed in constant rain and fog as a result, but there was no wind. The fog in this context was so rich in water vapor particles, so warm and yet immersed in absolute calm, in the eye of the storm, that it was almost as flat as a board. You could see reflections, and in a way, it was similar to mirages at sea on foggy days when ships see reflections of their own lights in front of them, making it appear as if there's another ship coming towards them, nearly causing a collision. But the effect here was magnified. The water wasn't uniform, so the entire city became a massive maze of distorted mirrors. Images were distant, elongated, gray, almost ghostly. This explained the figures. We were immersed in a labyrinth of vapor mirrors from which we couldn't escape. The only unexplained things at this point were the voices and the ghosts. But there's another theory, even more terrifying. You know those legends that say there's another world in mirrors where there are monsters that can haunt us? Now, imagine placing one mirror in front of another possessed mirror. It would create the effect of infinite reflections, and in all these reflections, we would have the ghost. If you then bent it within a radius of 30 kilometers, you'd have a crystalline city, full of facets, ghosts, full of mirrors everywhere. But then, where did that image come from, trapping us in this optical illusion for a month? Well, it is said that ghosts are more visible in mirrors, in photographs than in real life. Maybe at that moment, our city became an enormous crystal labyrinth, a magnifying glass between their world, our world, between the infinite potential of all universes. They saw us, and we heard them. We magnified the quantum world with a magnifying glass, or maybe a higher dimension. I haven't heard those whispers anymore, and my city hasn't had any more strange news. But there have been some discoveries that have worried me. They found that the corpse of a serial killer that the police had found 11 years ago was a fake, a mistake by forensics. In reality, that man had remained free in the woods around the city the whole time, precisely during the period when I was 8 years old. It's curious. According to reports, he loved to whisper to his victims, inviting them to come to the woods from afar, to open doors and windows using echoes and whispers. His favorite phrase that drove his victims to madness was, "You die." Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel for more creepypastas. Until the next one.